All right. Here, what we're going to look at tonight is the idea of parenting, and probably some of the biggest theological questions in the church are not settled in the pulpit. Some of the biggest theological questions in the church are settled in the nursery. What you find is a mother, brand new mother, has her little baby boy, and she hands it off to a wonderful grandmotherly saint in our nursery. And she then says to our nursery worker, if he needs anything, come get me. And then the service is over and the kid's been crying the whole time and the nursery worker didn't go get her. And the person kind of says, why didn't you get him? Why didn't you come get me? Oh, the kid just needs to cry. It's okay. It's no big deal. So it is a big deal. And what there really is a theological question of, does a person need grace or does a person need justice, holiness, and discipline? That question of, do I primarily need loving parents, or do I primarily need structured parents that offer structure, that offer, and so I would suggest to you that every kid is always asking three questions. And they ask it differently based on how old they are. They ask it differently developmentally. But every child, and I'm looking at my adult children today. And my adult children are asking the same questions. They just ask it differently as they get older. And I have less authority in answering it as they get older. But the three questions are, do you love me? Are there consequences to bad behavior, or are there rules to follow? And who's in charge? Do you love me? Are there rules to follow? And who's in charge? Now, the reason I think it's important that you know that those are the three basic questions every kid is always asking is, and the reason that God is so into parenting and takes parenting so seriously, is that parenting, those three questions align with the big theological questions in life. If you get these three theological questions correct, you might be reformed, you might be not reformed, but you can have a solid biblical theology if you can answer these three questions. And those three theological questions: is God gracious and is God gracious and loving? Is God holy and just? Is God sovereign? Those three theological questions are at the underpinning of good theology. Do I know God is loving and gracious, kind, extravagant in his love? Do I know God is holy? Do I know he is just? Do I know that he has standards that must be met because of his holiness and justice? And is God in charge or not? And if you get those three questions right in your theology, you might disagree about some things. But if you get those three questions right, you can have a very robust evangelical theology. Now, as a good Reformed guy, as a good Presbyterian, I got a whole list of other things I ought to know. I mean, I got books full of things I ought to know. However, those three things would be the building block of everything that I think they ought to know on top of that. It's the nature of who is God, what is his nature, because if you get that right, you're going to be okay. Now, don't we know churches that kind of only get one of those right? I mean, don't you know churches that only get God is gracious and loving, right? I mean, they get that right. And they're fun churches to go to, and they'll probably have a great show as their worship service, and it's kind of fun. But there's something missing. I mean, if you've been watching the Olympics or in the Super Bowl, there were all these commercials that it's not that the commercials were wrong. It's that the commercials were incomplete. And they would be, God gets you. Have you seen any of those commercials? They were real big during the Super Bowl. They played them during the Olympics. And basically, they're commercials that are saying, hey, you all misunderstand who God is. He really is good. He really is kind. He is gracious, and he gets you. That's true. But the reason that those commercials sometimes leave you feeling like, what is it about that I didn't like? It's because it's an incomplete picture of God. It's the sound of one hand clapping. It's like, yes, there is an infinitely gracious, loving God who gets you, who understands you, who knows you by name, who calls his children by name. But he's also a holy God, a righteous God, and a just God. And that seems to be missing in that commercial. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? Have you seen these commercials? And again, they're well done. And you see them and you kind of go, I think I like that. That seems. But the reason you don't feel like that's a complete picture to the world of who Christ is it just really just has one. And then don't we know churches? Haven't you been to a church before that seems to only get the idea of God as just? I mean, it's like, it's like, hi, welcome, you're going to hell. We're glad you're here, but, put on your asbestos suit because you're going to hell and I'm probably not. I mean, that's how they would usually present it. What they get correct is that God is holy and that he demands and expects that he's righteous. But it's incomplete. And then God's sovereignty, that's one of the underpinnings of Reformed theology. God's sovereignty is the idea that God is not a hapless observer of the world, but he is a sovereign God that is active and involved in the lives of this world and of his children. So what's this have to do with when somebody comes into your office or you're getting coffee with them and they're talking about their parenting? Just like most churches fall off one side or the other, don't recommend a parenting book to anybody until you know which side they fall off of. See, I'll have a call every once in a while. Somebody says, Dr. Coffield, our son Bobo, he got picked up drinking last night and the police picked him up driving. What should we do? My wife, what should we do? He's in juvenile or he's in jail. What should we do? And I can't answer that question unless I know how they've parented. And so I usually say something like, what would your tendency be? What would your kid think you're going to do? And if they say, our kid thinks we're going to just leave him in jail the rest of his life and that we may never speak to him again. And to that parent, because they've probably erred on the side of justice in their parenting, to that parent I'm going to say, well, I think you need to go pick him up. Because it sounds like what's been missing in their parenting is probably grace. But to the parent who says, I can't believe those police were so mean to pick him up. I can't believe they're not going to let us get him out till later on today. To that parent, I would say, what would it be like to leave him overnight in jail? Because it sounds like what they've probably been missing is the structure piece. Does that make sense? And so whenever you're asked to parent somebody, and here's what happens. It happens theologically in churches, and it happens in parenting groups. We find people who are similar to us. So all the parents that fall off the side of grace, they all get together and they have their books. And they'll get groups of people together and they'll talk about how they're supposed to be loving, gracious parents, and they'll be and they'll find books and they'll come together. And then the parents that are kind of falling off on the other side, they'll find their books, and then they'll all get together with their group, and it'll be like, well, a good thing we're not like them, and their kids are going to be wild someday, but our kids are going to be okay because we're giving them structure. And these people are saying, you know, our kids are going to be okay because we're giving them love, and all they're giving them are rules. And what happens, it happens in theology too. The churches that are too grace-based tend to find other churches that are too grace-based, and they have groups together and talk about the legalistic world over there. And then the super legalistic churches, they get together and they say, I've never heard a legalistic church say they're legalistic. I've never heard them say, you know, we're kind of legalistic. We kind of have a very unbalanced view of God, and we're going to celebrate the fact that he's mad at us. And I've never heard somebody say that, but they find each other. If you've got teenagers at all, you've noticed that they're able to find, if you drop them off at youth group, if your kid's struggling with their self-esteem and they're struggling with getting in trouble, you drop in youth group, and what they will find, somehow it's a magical thing that happens. They'll find the other kid out of the 70 kids there. They'll find the one kid who's also struggling with drugs or whatever. You know, it's like they find each other. And same thing with theological groups. It happens in our presbytery. The churches that tend to be a little more justice and holiness based, and they, you know, at presbytery, those pastors will all sit together. And the ones that are kind of a little bit too loosey-goosey, they all sit together. And you know that they're talking about the other people. You know they're going, I can't believe we let them in the PCA. And then these people are going, I can't believe we let them in the PCA. When the truth is, God invites us to live in tension about who he is, and that then filters down to in the way that we're to live our lives with others. And so be aware of those. Does that make sense? So don't give anybody parental advice until you know which side they tend to fall off for the other. Now, here's what everybody's going to say. Everybody's going to say, well, I'm balanced. I'm balanced. And when we talk about it in churches, most churches would say they're balanced, but the research on churches would say only about 22 or 25% of churches are balanced. Most of them are falling off one side or the other. And usually if they're falling off this side in terms of God, they'll also fall off that side in terms of parenting. If they fall off this side in terms of theology, they'll fall off this side in terms of parenting. Not always, but sometimes. So just be aware of that. So does that make sense? So let's just talk about a family. So let's put grace up here. And let's put holiness here or structure. You could put love and structure. You could put grace and justice or holiness, and whatever word communicates to you, it's kind of the same sort of thing. And so I'm going to put yes, no, yes, no. Now here's what's kind of funny. Secular research has stumbled on a version of this. Now they don't call it grace and they don't call it justice, but they'll talk about authoritarian parents, authoritative parents, permissive parents, and kind of balanced parents. And they don't use our terminology, but they've done some research that basically kind of goes around this very thing that I'm talking about. So what we really want our families to look like is yes when it comes to grace, and yes when it comes to holiness. So there's rules to follow, there's consequences for behavior, but it's in the foundationally in a base of love and grace. And by the way, the Bible does teach that children need discipline. As a matter of fact, the Bible's clear on that. The book of Proverbs would teach us that our children need discipline. We'll talk about what that might look like in a minute, but the real task of a parent is to move a child. According to the Bible, I'm born foolish. And foolishness is essentially believing my way is the best way. And my job as a parent is to move my child from foolish to wise. And wisdom is God's way is the best way. I mean, I know I know I just took huge theological categories and kind of made them as like low-hanging kindergarten fruit, but sometimes I need it to be that simple for me to understand it. And so my job with my children, they were born with a stubborn desire for their way is the right way. And my job is to teach them that God's way is the right way. Why is that so hard for us? I see that hand. Yes? It is because you're still struggling with foolishness yourself. I'm still on that journey from my way is the best way to God's way is the best way. I mean, I wrestle with that daily in my life. And so sometimes the reason parenting is so difficult is you're being asked to do something you're still in the middle of in your journey. Does it make sense? And so we'll talk about a couple of verses in a minute that might and just kind of might help us kind of solidify this. But so this is what we're looking for, and it's probably under 20% of the population. There's kind of an equal balance of structure and nurture. I'm watching my son Pierce, and we probably parented too much grace at times. Not way over the line, but I think we probably leaned over the line a little bit toward grace. And it's funny to see Pierce's reaction is he knows he needed more structure than what we probably provided. And to watch them parent today is like watching, a Gestapo, I mean, it's been amazing to watch them with a little cedar. They do a really good job, but he's correcting for structure. And then they like structure. And it's like, they don't like anything that's spontaneous. And it's like, have you been in our house? I mean, we've, and because they want everything structured all the way down the line. And watching them, because I think he's reacting to some of our parenting. But anyway, this is our goal. Healthiest kids show up, and the researchers, the secular researchers say that this is authoritarian parent. This is a parent who has authority, but there's some, as the kids get older, they participate in the rule making. There's grace involved in it. It's not just rules. And so what do you think a person would look like that has no grace, but a lot of rules?
She said dictator.
Yeah, that family is very authoritarian. Now, here's what's interesting. It works at first. And so if you've ever been around some people that really are pretty tough, I mean, just super, super rigid with their kids, at first, fear is a good motivator short term. I mean, if somebody came in here with a gun and said, get on the floor, we'd all get on the floor because we were scared to death. But if he was standing here for 6 hours, I think we'd start going, I'm not motivated to stay on the floor. Let's figure out a way to move this. And so this is going to create a compulsive, compliant kid that is going to be very compliant, but sometimes struggle with compulsivity, sometimes struggle with eventually in their lives, because there's it's somebody that'll create kind of fear as one of the basic motivators of their life, because they don't want to mess, because you're fearful if you think if you mess up, you lose love, right? And so that's the compulsive compliant kid. So if you want to, and Liz, by the way, I'm definitely oversimplifying this. What would be somebody who has yes grace, but no real structure? That's going to create an entitled, lower achieving person, because there's not going to be much fear of if I mess up, what happens to me. Instead, there's not going to be any consequences of my behavior, and since there's no consequences for my behavior, what is it C.S. Lewis says, that we only change when there's pain involved. And so if there's no consequences for what I do when I do something wrong, I'm going to become, I'm going to become indulgent and entitled, right? And don't we have a lot of that going on in our culture today? I mean, a lot of kids, it's like, you expect me to come to work on time? It's like, why should I follow any rules? And it's been funny, as Skylar is now in his 30s, we've tried to provide structure for Skylar, and it's our responsibility. He's our kid, not anybody else's, so we're the ones that have created the mess we've created at times. But he gets rewarded for begging every day. And whatever you reward will increase. I mean, one of the problems socially, I mean, not to be political, but one of the problems in our culture is we've rewarded the wrong behavior for years. We reward people who don't do things. Like in the housing crisis of '08, we didn't, I remember our house in Florida was upside down by almost $100,000. And now you think, well, you must have owned a really, really expensive house. No, we owned a pretty moderate little house, but it was so upside down at that time in Florida that we were upside down by about $100,000. I was paying every month because I signed a paper I'd pay every month. And I remember I called the bank and saying, hey, listen, I understand that there's some help for people, with this crisis. And the guy said, have you been paying? And I said, well, yeah, I'm supposed to. And he said, well, there's no programs for you. And I said, who are the programs for? Well, if you're behind 3 or 4 months, the government will subsidize the bank. And I thought, I think we're rewarding the wrong people here. I think we should go to the people that are paying their mortgage even though they feel stupid because they said they would do it, and we ought to reward those people. Instead, we rewarded the people who, and I had people all over our neighborhood who walked away from their house, and then they had a friend buy it for cheaper from the bank, and then they got it back, and I know people that short sold their houses, and there weren't any programs for the people that were doing the right thing. And the banks didn't suffer much. They were all subsidized. And I remember looking at the end of that and going, we've rewarded the wrong behavior. We've done that socially. We reward people who don't get married. We reward people who, we've just rewarded the wrong behavior a lot.
Like rewarding our politicians.
Well, yeah, we've kind of rewarded the wrong, we've encouraged the wrong behavior. And whatever you reinforce or whatever you, whatever you endorse will increase. Whatever you punish goes away or diminishes. And so, anyway, so this kid, this is a compulsive compliant kid. This is the indulgent, entitled kid. What if you have somebody who comes from no love and no structure? Well, that's a sad kid, and that's a kid that's going to be distant and defiant at some level. You know, and it's interesting. There were a couple of shows a few years ago. I don't even know if they're still on, but they would take these kids from the inner city, these kids that were just out of control, just wild kids that had no love, no structure, and they'd put them on some farm in Montana with very rigid, usually Christian parents. Did you ever see any of these shows? And these kids would just blossom, you know? And the reason is they got structure. You know, all of a sudden there's a consequence for their behavior. You can't talk to your mother that way. You can't talk to, because kids want structure. And they also want love. And so just be aware that, and is this oversimplified? Sure it is. You know, a lot of times one parent will be more grace-based, one parent will be more righteousness-based. Then it gets kind of, but in general, I wanted to give you kind of a template to kind of say, okay, how do I think about parenting as a Christian when people are going to come talk to me about what I should do and how I should parent? And to me, this is an incredibly just helpful model for me to kind of say, okay. And so I kind of put in my mind, I listen to them talk about what they do and how they parent. And in my mind, I kind of put them in one of these categories, not to label them but the advice is going to be different based on where they live. If you give this parent the high righteous, high holy, not a lot of grace parent a book like Raising Kids God's Way, they're going to, it's like their kids already, you're feeding a beast. By the way, I do want to say, and this steps on some toes in the PCA world, I find the book, I like Tripp's book on parenting, Shepherding the Heart of a Child. I think that's a good book. I think that's fairly balanced. I think it might slightly bend toward justice and holiness, but I think it's a really good book. I think he does a good job. The Raising Kids God's Way books, or you might have seen those as the Baby Wise books. Some people, I find those to be very difficult, not good books to recommend to either side. The reason is that they assume that the only thing a child needs is discipline, and they believe that an infant is manipulating their parents. And a 6-month-old child does not have object permanence yet. The brain of a 6-month-old child, they don't have object permanence. The reason a little 7-year-old likes to play peekaboo is they think you're doing magic. You know what I mean by peekaboo, where you kind of just do this, and then you pull the blanket down, and the kid goes, and then you put the blanket back up, and the kid is looking around. It's like in their brain, you disappeared. It's like, wow, it's magic. And you're going, this child is not very bright. But they can end up being a Rhodes Scholar, but their brain at that point doesn't have object permanence. And if your brain doesn't have object permanence, I'm not sure I'm going to give it the ability to manipulate. Manipulation requires me knowing what you want, me then making a choice to do something to manipulate you to give you what I want. That's a fairly sophisticated brain move, and that's not going to get there till about a year one. James Dobson used to say that it's impossible to spoil a child in the first year of its life. And I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but I'm just saying that initially a child, you've got to understand developmentally what the brain has and doesn't have. Does it work to let your kid cry out? Yeah. But what has it may possibly created? It might be creating a child that doesn't believe that their needs matter, and so all that to say, so in baby wise and raising kids God's way, they would say that you spank a 3-month-old who wiggles when you're putting on diapers. I go, at 2 years old, we'll talk about that. But I'm a little nervous about that book. But there are good books out there, like Tripp's book like I said, it's very good. I think there's some good parenting books out there, but I would steer clear of those. And those are pretty popular in the PCA. And part of that is that they work short term. Because fear does motivate a kid at first. So are you with me on this? Does it make sense? Let's talk about a couple Bible verses. I always had this fear that I wrote with, some sort of permanent marker on the board, but I did not. So what's probably the most common verse used for parenting? Train a child in the way he should go, and when he's older, he will not depart. Now, one of the great privileges of being at RTS is that you just had Greek and Hebrew scholars kind of walking around there's some of those professors there in chapel. They didn't even use a regular Bible. They used Hebrew or the original Greek, and I'm going. But Bruce Walke, probably one of the most brilliant, one of the smartest human beings I've ever met, and I had a conversation once about that verse, raise up a child in the way he should go. And he said, it's not completely incorrect the way it's traditionally understood. But it's traditionally, at least in East Tennessee, that verse is understood this way. You take your kid to church every day. You read the Bible to them morning to night. And when they're a teenager, they may get buck wild, but they'll come back to them. And that's how that verse is often kind of East Tennesseed. And he said that it's not bad to think of that verse as kind of a principle that what you put into a child, you tend to get out. I mean, in one sense. But he said if you know the Hebrew of what that verse says, it makes it much richer, and it's much more than just, send your kids to church on Sunday. The word raise up a child in the way he should go, raise up, comes from a Hebrew word that was used by midwives. The root of that word is used by midwives when a baby was first born, and they would try to create a desire for the child to suck. And so they would, if you know an infant and you just do this to their lip, there's often they will begin that sucking process, because that's what God put in them to make them survive. And so one way to see that verse, according to Bruce Walke, would be parent in such a way that creates a desire for God. And so the first part of that verse, can I get some water? Would somebody just grab me a water bottle out there? So raise up a child in the way, he's got it, he's getting it, he's good, thank you. To raise up a child in the way he should go is to parent a child in the way that gives them a desire. I used to think, before I had kids, I would never do it now because it's not biblical and it would be too risky. But I used to think before I had kids, I'd say, I'm just not going to tell my kids about Jesus. What I'm going to do is Mona and I are going to leave every Sunday morning and tell them we're going to a special meeting that they're not allowed to go to, and get a babysitter and have them, and we come back, and they ask us about it, we go, oh, nothing. And then like when they're 15 or 16, say, okay, I'm going to let you in on the big secret. Jesus loves you. He's holy, he's righteous, he's sovereign, and introduce them to the gospel, and let them be surprised by the beauty of the gospel, because sometimes the way that we parent, we almost inoculate kids to the real gospel. I mean, the way an inoculation works, as you know, is in order to not get the flu, I'm going to give you a little bit of the flu, right, in this injection. I'm going to give you a little bit of the flu, so that your body can build up an immunity to the flu, so when the real flu comes along, you don't get sick. And sometimes I think we do that in our parenting. Because we're not creatively thinking about how do I raise my children in a way that creates a desire for them for spiritual things. Instead, it's just does that make sense? If Mona was reflecting on things parenting today, and I don't know if my wife's a really good writer, and she wrote something on Facebook today about the fact, and I realize I'm going to get in trouble with some other guys in the presbytery about graven images. I get that, but Skylar can't read, and one of the reasons I have as an exception to in my process of being licensed was my view of graven images does not. I think it's psychologically impossible to not create an image in your mind when you read the Bible. The Bible's full of imagery. I mean, when it describes the Ark of the Covenant, it tells colors and sizes. And when it talks about the burning bush, you can't not create that in your mind. The Bible's written in a way that makes you create those images in your mind. And so, and for my son who can't read, how's he going to meet Jesus? He loves movies about Jesus. And so, recently, and I'm not saying this is good parenting, I'm just saying, but recently he decided he wanted an action figure of Jesus. And we assumed that didn't really exist. I mean, I'd be embarrassed if I owned a company that made action figures of Jesus, like, hey, he's walking on water. But there is a company evidently that does that, and we bought it. And so Skylar has a little, you've probably seen it. He has I'd call it a doll, an action figure of Jesus. And he carries it with him sometimes. And so when he was at physical therapy this last week, he said in the middle of the lobby, he says, "Don't worry, I've got Jesus right here with me." And I thought, that's pretty good theology. That's and to his physical therapist was telling me, he said something like, "Do you want to meet Jesus?" And I thought, I should be asking the lady that question. Instead, he is. But there's something about maybe the way Mona's parented him. I don't know what's going on in his mind. I've never been able to figure it out. But there does seem to be a curiosity about faith in Jesus. And I think Mona, much better than I, probably is parented in such a way that created some desire or some question or some curiosity. And so I think that's what the beginning of that verse is best understood, not just take your kid to church, but parent in such a way that creates a desire, that creates a longing in them, that helps them. And the reason that's okay is God put that longing in us. And so it's not like you've got creation on your side. That's how God made us. And so parent with that in mind. And then the verse goes on to say, and when he's older, raise up a child in the way he should go, and when he's older, he will not depart from that. In the way he should go is a phrase that really is talking about, it's not wrong to see it the way most people have traditionally interpreted that. But it's richer if you understand that that's a phrase that often was used to describe the way that a reed bends in the wind. And it's probably better to understand that verse as parent your children with a desire to create a desire for them to know God based on the way that they're bent. And if you do that, they won't depart from it. It makes sense to them. My son Pierce is an introvert, and I'm an extrovert. And introverts need time to think about what they want to say and do. extroverts, we don't know what we're going to do until we're saying it out loud. I mean, if you ever, whenever I preach here, don't come to the first service because I haven't figured it out yet because I haven't heard me say it out loud yet. The second service is always better because I've heard it out loud. I usually try to practice out loud one time because I need to almost be saying it for me to learn from it. There's a big kind of mega church in Florida that I spoke at one time, and they had a Saturday night service, 3 Sunday morning services, 1 Sunday night service, and 1 Monday night service. And so, and Mona's the only person who listened to all my sermons. And she goes, oh, it was so different Monday night than where it started Saturday because I'm an extrovert. And that's how extroverts my son's an introvert. And I parented him like he was an extrovert for years. You know, he'd do something right. I need to know what's going on with you right now. And, you know, I understand. Cat's got your tongue? What's wrong? You know, and what he really needed me to say is, you need to go to your room. This is what's happened. You need some time to figure this out. But you're gonna be responsible for what happened, and we're gonna talk about that in 10 minutes. And give that introverted part of him a chance to kind of catch up with his extroverted father. And it probably wasn't until he was in middle school I figured that out. That's raising a child in the way he should go, and understanding his bent. It's not, I've always thought good parenting was you do the same thing to every kid. That's not true. God doesn't do things that way. He doesn't treat me the same way he treats you, and he treats me based on who I am and who he made me to be. And good parenting does the same thing. But that passage, raise a child in the way he should go, and when he's older, he will not depart, is best understood as raise your kid with a curiosity for the gospel. Raise your kid in a way that will create a desire for them to know God. And do that based on the way that they're bent, their wiring. And when you do that, that's your best chance for kind of a good outcome, because you're parenting to their style of understanding, and you're doing it creatively with how do I create desire. Does that make sense? By the way, it's kind of funny. I've told I don't do parenting conferences anymore. I always get nervous whenever I talk about parenting. Because it's a little harder than I thought it would be when I first started. I thought I'd figure it out, and I'd figure out the formula, and my kids would all turn out perfect, and that just didn't happen. I've had some real good conversations with my adult children about the mistakes I've made along the way. For they are many. Kind of a funny story. I've told this story enough, some of you have heard it, but there's a Christian radio station in Orlando called, their tagline, their tagline, their advertising line is safe for the little ears. And so it was Joy 62, safe for the little ears in the back seat of your car. And so one day Mona and Skylar were driving, and they said, 5th caller wins tickets to Disney Night of Joy. So Mona pulls off, she calls a number, and she gets in. And so now Mona is on live Christian radio in a city that I'm a seminary professor in. Now, let me stop the story right there in the car with Mona on the live Christian radio. There is a dump button. There is a 5-second deal, but I don't think they've ever used it on Christian radio that's safe for the little ears. Why would they be paying attention? So let me stop the story there and kind of go to the day before. We had television on, and we had the show Everyone Loves Raymond on. Not a great show. It's really more of a tragedy than a comedy because it's a horrible family. But there's a father on there named Frank. Are y'all familiar with this show? It was, I'm dating myself by telling this story even. Well, Frank said, Frank had a somewhat colorful vocabulary, and so the night before that show was on, and Skylar watched Everyone Loves Raymond. And so now, with that as a caveat, let's go back to live Christian radio in Orlando, Florida. And so Mona gets in and said, "You're the fifth caller, congratulations." And Mona, on the radio, says, "Skylar, we won." And Skylar says, "Crap, holy crap, holy crap, 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 holy crap." Now, we don't usually talk that way in our home, but Frank talked that way. And the guy on the radio was just shocked. He's like, "Is everything okay? Have you been in an accident?" And Mona's going, no, everything's okay. And Skylar in the background keeps going, "Crap, crap, crap, holy crap, holy crap." And so I can no longer speak about parenting within like 100 miles of Orlando. So another funny story about parenting. So we're living, and our neighbor asks my son Pierce to watch their house while they go on vacation. So, he was still pretty young, and so he said yes, and so I went with him the first time. I had the key, and we went in the house, and I started looking around like any of us would look around our houses of other people when we can, and their son, who was the same age as Pierce, had a room. In his bedroom, he was obsessive compulsive, and so he had all his Legos by color and size, and his room was like a warehouse of organization. I mean, labels, and it was just, and so I decided, I don't listen to any of this material, when I'm really parenting, and so I decided to use guilt and shame, and so I said, "Pierce, look at the way he keeps his room." And Pierce wasn't trying to be a smart aleck. He just said what came to his mind, and he said, "I guess he was just raised better than me." I remember thinking, oh, never mind. Let's go on back down to our house. So anyway, parenting is a little bit of a mystery. Another verse that you'll find that's often talked about is spare the rod, spoil the child. And a lot of times I've heard that verse used to justify, I think, what I would consider to be abusive today. And so I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about spanking. First of all, the Bible is clear. Children need discipline, structure. They're not born with that. That has to be put on them. Just like they're not born knowing that they have value and they've got dignity. And so you live in the tension of giving them both of those things. And so the Bible does not give you an option of you've got to discipline your children. Sometimes, is spanking okay? And based on that passage, many people would say, well, that Bible mandates I'm supposed to spank. And I think that verse mandates that I'm supposed to discipline. Here's something interesting. The research is overwhelmingly against spanking. The secular research on parenting is overwhelmingly against spanking. And so, as a psychologist, I had to figure out what's going on here. The Bible seems to indicate that discipline is mandatory and that spanking is an option within that. And by that I mean, you don't spank a 13-year-old, a 12, there's limits. We quit spanking Skylar because he didn't understand it. It just wasn't effective. He still needed discipline, but that wasn't the way to discipline him. But when the research is overwhelmingly against, and the Bible seems to leave the door open to it, what is that about? And I would suggest to you that what it's about is that none of the research doesn't tend to look at the motivation of the parent. the research tends to look at spanking yes or spanking no, and then effectiveness. And that's not how the Bible would see your parenting. The Bible we're never supposed to discipline out of anger. The goal of discipline is not, I'm going to give you something to cry about. That's not a biblical reason to discipline. And when I'm honest, about 3/4 of the times that I spanked my kids, it was because I was angry. That's not biblical discipline. And so I think spanking is a biblical option as one of the things for disciplining children. It's not the only option. Disciplining has to be there, but the motivation of the parent is the issue. And when I'm honest, a lot of times I spanked when the kids were young. It was because I was angry, and that's never appropriate. You spank because I want to correct, I want to teach, and I want to engage. And I want there to be structure and consequences, not because I'm so tired of hearing you're fussing at me. That's more likely what you would have heard from me before I spanked, was like, you just got on my last nerve, and that's not biblical discipline. Does that make sense? And so I don't get nervous about research because I think I kind of like a good scientist. But when they come up with something that I don't think fits Scripture, I look into it more because I know that I can count on Scripture. And I think that passage leaves open the possibility, it makes discipline not an option. It does leave open the possibility of corporal or spanking as a possible option, but it doesn't leave it open as an option out of anger, but out of correction. Does that make sense? And that brings me up to another idea I want you to think about when it comes to parenting, and that's to think about the motives of your kids. There's probably 1,000 reasons kids misbehave. Usually it's because they're foolish and they want their own way, but typically kids misbehave because they want attention, power, revenge, or they want to frustrate you and get you to leave them alone. And it's helpful to know what's motivating a kid, because sometimes we give them the very thing that they're wanting. You ever been at Walmart and there's a lady in front of you with a little baby, or a kid, not a baby, maybe a toddler, and the kid screams and goes, I want a piece of candy. And you kind of back away and you go, this is going to be ugly, and the kid's screaming, and then the mother says, I am not giving you a piece of candy. I will bust your butt. You will not get a piece of candy. And at that point, you're backing up. We've all been there, right? Is this not a scene that you've lived out at your local Walmart every once in a while? And then you kind of back up and kind of go, okay. And then the kid goes, I just want a piece of candy. And the mother still, maybe the second time, is still going, you will not get a piece of candy. Then 9 times out of 10, here's what happens next. Okay, you can have this candy, but never again. And the kid looks and smiles. And they just rewarded the wrong behavior. This happens with Skylar all the time. Skylar is better at being 7 years old than any 7-year-old you've ever met, because he's been 7 his whole life. And so we'll go into McDonald's, and he'll say, and I'll start, and this is how our conversation goes. We're walking in McDonald's, and I say, Skylar, we are not getting a toy today. We're not coming here for a toy. We're coming here, and I know McDonald's food isn't really food, but we're coming here for food, not toys. And he goes, okay. Now we're standing at the counter, and there's a 15-year-old, 16-year-old high school girl who's making minimum wage standing there. And we order the food, and then Skylar looks at this girl and says, "Could I just look at the toy?" And I then turn to him and say, "We're not here for a toy. I told you that. We're here to get food." The little 16-year-old girl looks at me like, "Did Hitler have children?" and then Skylar will say something like, "I just want to see it." The girl will pull out the toy and show it to Skylar. And Skylar will go, "Ah, that's exactly what I wanted."
Of course.
And I say, "We're not here to buy toys." Another glare from the 16-year-old girl who is thinking, why did they even allow him to have children? And then we get our bag and we're in the car, and what do you think's in there? Every time there's a toy. And then Skylar looks at me like, "Hey, big boy." It's amazing to me. I've seen Skylar use his autism to get toys. That's why I remember the first time I told you that I don't think it's so simple as a lot of people in the biblical counseling world make it out to be. You know, it's medical, deal with it medically, and if it's spiritual, deal with it spiritually. And sometimes I don't know, I don't have a scalpel sharp enough sometimes to know that. Now, you get to spend time with Skylar pretty regularly now. Isn't he just relentless on toys? I mean, and he talked a medical doctor out of a stethoscope. I mean, I don't mean a toy stethoscope. I don't mean a plastic stethoscope. I mean a real live $150, $200, medical supply store stethoscope. I come in the hospital and Skylar's wearing that around his neck, and I go, "Where did you get that?" He goes, "Doctor gave it to me." And I mean, that guy doesn't have a clue. He was played like a fiddle. I mean, because so we've rewarded the wrong behavior there a little bit at times, but the world has as well. And there's a relentlessness there. I think my point was, you don't get a chance. We don't get an option to discipline or not. We do have some options of how we discipline, and you need to do that based on the way the child's bent. Some kids, spanking it can be effective when they're real young. Some kids, that's not effective at all. And you've got to figure which one of those it is for your kid before you kind of put a, one-size-fits-all sort of experience. So what I was getting at in that story is that sometimes I've seen parents actually create a system that they're almost doing the opposite of what they want because of the way they're parenting, the way they're not realizing the kid's wanting attention, then they're giving them attention. They're not realizing the kid wants power, and they're giving him power. And they're almost encouraging the very behavior they hate. And so it's a good idea to kind of have people kind of aware of that sort of, that sort of deal. It's not a bad idea if you just want it, if I were in charge of like a parenting program at a church, one of the things I would do is I would get parents to, I'd find a good developmental psychology book that talks about how kids develop and let people know what's kind of appropriate, what can a brain do at this age versus this age versus this age. Kids don't get abstract reasoning, or what is sometimes called formal operations, until they're 12 or 13 years old. One of the reasons I hated poetry is I had a fourth grade teacher who loved poetry. And she would every day do poetry. And I'm in the third, fourth grade, and for me, I'm really, my brain is very black and white in those days as any third and fourth grader. And I'll remember this. I don't remember what I had for dinner yesterday, but I remember being a third grader, and she she's reading the Robert Frost poem or some poem about the horse stopping in the woods. And she goes, "So what's this poem about?" "It's about a horse that stops in the woods." And she goes, "Oh no. What do you all think it's about?" "It's about a horse that stops in the woods," because black and white, concrete, that's what it was about. She goes, "No, the horse represents every man." And I'm going, "Every man? It's a horse stopping in the woods." And I remember arguing with her, and she was so exasperated, and I thought, I can't stand poetry. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's because I didn't have formal operations. I didn't have abstract thinking yet. It's why a lot of kids don't like algebra. Because algebra is somewhat abstract, right? Instead of, 2 plus 2 equals 4, it's 2 plus x equals 4. Let's solve for x. And so a kid who doesn't have abstract reasoning is going, why is there a letter in my math problem? Why is it 2x equals 10? What? And then I'm going to solve for x. What does that even mean? Why do you have a letter? Oh, it could have been any letter. It could have been y. Could have been z. I mean, the letter doesn't matter. It's a variable. I mean, if you don't have abstract reasoning, you'll hate math. And sometimes what we do is we before kids have that abstract reasoning, we try to teach them abstract things, and they get frustrated with it. All that to say, I think it would be helpful to know the developmental process of kids as we parent, so that we kind of are aware of kind of the stages of their brain, how it works, how they think, how kids think is kind of a helpful thing to know. Which brings me to adolescence, and if I have time, I'd like to just talk a little bit about adolescence. I've got 10 minutes, so let's talk fast. What is difficult about adolescents? They have abstract reasoning. Abstract reasoning allows you to realize that other families aren't like yours. Up until that point, whatever your family was seems normal. If your family was, serial killers, you kind of think everybody's family is a serial killer. If you think what you know is what you know. But once you get abstract reasoning, you go, gosh, I'd be different if I was raised by my neighbor. I'd be different if I, so adolescence is the beginning of understanding a gap between a person's condition and their calling. So this is a gap between who I am and who I want to be. And most fourth graders don't feel that. I don't think Skylar feels that. I think there's something deep in him that is aware that he's supposed to be a 36-year-old man, and therefore is a little frustrated. But I don't think he could consciously talk about that. He doesn't have the cognitive ability to kind of go, here's what I want to be, here's what I am. Every once in a while, it'll be like, I wish I could drive like my brother. Or I wish you didn't hang around like you do and I could just have some freedom. But he doesn't have an ongoing dialogue about the disappointment between what they were made to be, what is ideal versus real. That gap between our condition and our calling, if you will. And so, adolescents hate the thought of being caught with that gap. I love watching adolescents in the mall, or just watching them kind of go through the other day, the prime timers, what a picture. The prime timers, we had our Bible study. We went to Buddy's Barbecue to eat, and it was the first day of school. And so we're there at 12 noon, and middle school lets out. And so all these middle schoolers came in to Buddy's Barbecue, and watching them engage each other, watching the hierarchy of who's in charge and who's cool and who isn't, and watching that was just fascinating. It's just amazing to see. But what every one of them is trying to hide this gap, this disappointment between who they are and what they wish they were. I wish I was better looking. I wish I was smarter. I wish my hair was longer. I wish my hair was shorter. I wish my body looked different. Just think of what adolescents think. They feel like their body is at war with them. That's the first time a person tastes the deep disappointment of living in a fallen world is adolescence. It's interesting. Suicide has a bimodal distribution, meaning that there's a cluster. Suicides are higher at adolescence or teenage years to about 21, 22. And then in the elderly. Now, there's also it's not like suicide goes to zero at the other times. But I would suggest to you in those times, people they're dealing with the same thing. The adolescence is looking at life ahead of them and going, I don't think it'll become what I hoped. I'm a little disappointed. And the elderly or the over 65 person like myself is kind of looking back and going, I'm disappointed. It didn't turn out quite the way I wanted. And there's kind of three strategies to deal with the gap. There's I'll close the gap by trying real hard. And those kids that come to they're the kids that are our first youth group, and they're doing great. Now the problem is that they don't close the gap that way, and so eventually they're going to be disappointed again. But initially and so this kid might they might close the gap with athletics or with looks or popularity, but they close the gap with something, or at least they think they're closing the gap. And so the way they close the gap is they raise the bottom up. Does that make sense? And you see those kids. We think their parents did a great job, and maybe it has very little to do with parenting. Maybe they just were really good in athletics, or they're real good looking, or they were Presbyterian. Who knows? We just know that they've decided that they're going to close the gap by their hard work. And quite frankly, that a little of that's not bad. I mean, you want the kids to try hard, to do well in school and such. And so that's one strategy. The next strategy is the opposite, and that says, I'm going to close the gap by lowering everybody's expectations. Here, I'll close the gap. I can't do it. I'm helpless. I'm hopeless. And so, and you'll find one of these kids, both of these kids in the same family sometime, and this kid gets a B, and the parents go, I can't believe we got a B. What are we doing? We need to bring that B up next time. This kid gets a B, and they're having a party. It's like, whoa, a B. That's good. That's good that you didn't get a D this time. I mean, and it's like, when in the same family, one is, chastising them for a B, the other is celebrating a B, because the kids have displayed a different way of dealing with that disappointment. Does that make sense? And it's helpful for you to know how your kid chooses to deal with the disappointment. The third way to deal with is what I call some people might call it a party kid, but they just say, hey, there's no gap. And they live about an inch deep and 10 miles wide, and they're real busy. I mean, they're involved in 6 youth groups. They're just busy all the time. They're in 10 clubs at church, at school. They're doing everything because they don't want to stop long enough to feel that gap. And so they live an inch deep, 10 miles wide, and boom, boom, boom. And it's helpful when you parent adolescents to kind of be aware that this is what they're wrestling with. Now, do they know that? No, they don't. They might be able to articulate the disappointment that they feel. They might be able to articulate the gap, but one of the things about adolescence is they don't connect their heart and their head. They don't know why they do what they do. One of the tasks of good parenting for adolescents is to help them connect their heart and their head. There's a reason we do what we do. We're teleological beings. There's a reason you feel the way you feel and do what you do. You're not just random. And that's why the favorite thing a kid says usually is when you ask them, what did you do? Nothing, or I don't know. Hey, well, how did I do? I don't know. Here's the secret. Try this next time. I know it's going to sound obnoxious. But the next time you're adolescents or somebody says to you, I don't know, in counseling, if somebody says, I don't know to me, do you know what I say? This is free. This is free. I say, if you did know, what would it be? And it's amazing. I mean, I know you think, you've got a PhD and that's all you're giving us? You're telling us. But you'd be amazed how often somebody's in there and I say, well, so what do you think's going on? They go, I don't know. They kind of nod and validate. Yeah, it's hard to figure out. Hey, but if you did know, what would it be? And they go, well, I think it's because I really hate my wife. And I go, wow, okay, we're on to something. I mean, it's amazing how often, especially an adolescent, will kind of go to the, I don't know. And so you got to kind of push past that. What if you did know? What if you could know? What'd that be? Adolescents are typically asking 3 tasks. How do I find love in an increasingly selfish world? How do I find that's security. How do I find security or love in an increasingly selfish world? How do I find significance in an increasingly complex world? How do I find, we all want significance, security, and safety in our lives. And so adolescents are saying, how do I find significance in a world that doesn't value me much? How do I find love in a world that seems selfish? And how do I find safety in an ever-changing world? And that's why they join gangs and hang out with the wrong people, because they're giving them those things. They're giving them safety. They're giving them something to go for. So, hey, it's 8 o'clock, and we're supposed to finish at 8 o'clock every week. Anybody have any comments or thoughts on this? By the way, if you're watching this, because we are putting this on thing, there's thousands of people in the room where it's almost trouble getting to even ask these kind of questions. But anybody have any questions or thoughts? I think it's pretty good. If I'm going to have my theology and my parenting questioned, Jesus was criticized for being too grace-based. Paul is criticized in his theology for being too grace-based. Jesus was considered, they called him a glutton because he would be with tax collectors and eat dinner with them and that sort of stuff. So if you're going to be criticized, err on the side of grace, but only a little bit. Yeah, my son Pierce, great kid. Came over and helped me change my tire today. Great kid. But he never took care of anything we gave him. So I think we're fairly generous. So we didn't have much money, but when he turned 16 or 17, I guess he waited until he was 17, I figured out a way to kind of find an old vehicle for him to have. And I said, you need to take care of it. But he didn't have to work for it. Because he didn't work for it, he didn't take care of it. And after it blew up because it didn't have oil in it, I didn't learn my lesson of parenting. And so I figured out a way to get him another car that he didn't take care of either. And it's interesting, he's really pretty meticulous. And the stuff that he has purchased, he takes great care of it. And I think with him, I should have erred a little bit more on the other side. Because I don't think he didn't respond to grace. He would have responded more to justice. There's consequences here. Kim, my daughter, and Skylar, I think they respond more to grace. But, so we're going back to that verse, raise a child in the way he should go. So, but basically, I would say if you're going to err, even theologically or parenting, err slightly. God doesn't want us to err. God wants us to live in the tension of both of those truths. But it's easier to add structure later than it is to add love later. If somebody grows up, I'm watching this with our foster child that Kim and Noah have. He would be the no love, no structure. And And it's easier for him to believe there's consequences than there is that he's loved. And so what he needs now is a lot more grace than structure. But there's going to be a point where he's going to need both. And there'll be but all that to say, there's a tension. Does that make sense? It is a modern concept, but to say you don't believe in it is like saying I don't believe in the Beatles, because they were here. I don't like the Beatles though, and I wish they hadn't messed up music the way they did. That's not true. I kind of like the Beatles, but you're exactly right. If you went to your great grandfather and said, adolescence starts at 12 and ends at 22, they'd go, what? Because in the old Jewish culture, your bar mitzvah, you were in adolescence for your bar mitzvah. So when the bar mitzvah began, you were a boy. When it's over, you were a man. And that's all there was to it. There was a rite of passage that made you a man. And it's like, that's the way it ought to be. And there's some things that have influenced that. One is the amount of education people need to be able to work a job that they might want to work that would be more of a career type job. I do think it's important. I think having kids work is a good idea. Most of the research suggests that. And plus, I think biblically it suggests that. But adolescence is real. I mean, it's real because that's what they live in, and that's the way the world treats them. Is it really a biblical concept? No. I mean, I think a biblical concept is that there's a point in your life where you shift from being a boy to where you become a man, or you shift from a girl. And it usually was related to when puberty took place and when your body became the body of an adult male or adult female, you were considered an adult, and you'd go with your father to work or the field. You'd go with your mother to learn what she was doing. But that's, in an industrial society, we don't do that. Because I can't bring my kid to work every day. And there's nothing for him to do here every day to bring him here. And so, because their society has changed, you do have to live with the reality of adolescence, even though you're exactly right. Is it a biblical concept? No. I mean, adolescence lasts. I mean, there's even a book that was out by a psychologist called All Grown Up and No Place to Go. And it talks about the idea that that what is the marker for adolescence? And if it's puberty, it's when a woman gets her first period, or when a boy goes through puberty, that's the marker for the beginning, I guess, of adolescence. But what's the marker for the end? When you get out of college? When you get married? And so, I mean, one of the reasons we have such a problem with lots of things is that it's awkward to stand with one foot on the dock and one foot on the boat. That's awkward. And it's probably better to just kind of go, I'm on the dock, I'm on the boat. But adolescence is one foot on the dock, one foot on the boat for about 10 years. And you can say, we're not going to participate in that. We're just putting them in the boat. Because we're not putting up with this. We're not going to, but that's not the way the world will treat them, and that's not what they'll experience in school or in society. And so you do need to prepare them for living in the world they will be given. And the world they will be given has adolescence lasting about 10 years, which is crazy. I mean, should adolescence, I mean, think about it. 150 years ago, you're 14 years old, you're 13 years old, you've gone through puberty, you're with your dad doing, you're a blacksmith, or you're out in the farm, tending cattle. No one's saying to you, let's close that gap between who you are and who you want to be. I mean, let's get to work. But it's almost impossible to do that today. And so for Christians, I think we need to reestablish what I would say would be kind of rituals that, like like bar mitzvahs and that, we wouldn't do bar mitzvahs, but I mean, when my kid turns 16, this is what I'm going to do with them. Kind of rites of passages. In most societies, there's rites of passage. We don't have rites of passage in our society. So, nobody knows when it starts, nobody knows when it stops. And it's kind of wild. So, a great question. And in one sense, you're right. In another sense, that's not the world that they will live in. And so, you'll kind of become the Amish family. That it's not bad to be Amish. Maybe we shouldn't have electricity. Maybe that's a better way to live. The research says that the Amish are the happiest subgroup in America. Maybe they're right. However, my kids, since I'm not Amish, I'm going to have to raise them in a way for them to live in the culture and I want them to engage that culture for Christ. And so it's to be mindful of what you've talked about, but be aware that they're going to live in a world that doesn't treat them that way. And it's really weird because they're treated like adults in some ways at 12. I mean, you watch the way the kids were dressed at Buddy's barbecue. I'm going to sound like your grandfather, but I mean, I'm thinking, well, we know where the strippers of the next generation are coming from. I mean, it was like, holy cow, what are these little kids wearing? And it seems sad even, just like they didn't even know to be embarrassed by how they were dressed. And but I regress. But that's really a good point. And it was a little smart alecky, by the way, for me to say, well, that means you don't believe in the Beatles. But no, there is a way in which the world that your kids are growing up in is a world that treats adolescence as a 10 to 12 year process. And is that healthy? You don't really have that option. I mean, because you can't, I mean, child labor laws wouldn't let them work as much as you would have if it was 100 years ago. Because 100 years ago, they're out at 6 a.m. milking cows. And they're not going to school. I mean, they're finishing, they don't go to school past that. Does that make sense? Hey, let me pray for us and then we're out of here. Father, as we've talked about our parenting today, we just acknowledge that all of us have failed a little bit at parenting. And as I pray to you, you are a good father that has not failed in parenting of us. You've been both holy and just. You've been both gracious and kind. And you allowed us to live in the tension of that delight. So, Father, I pray that I just guard people that you'd guard them from feeling shame or guilt about the way they've parented or not parented. And instead that we would just humbly come to you with what do we do next? And we would trust you with results. We pray in the powerful name of Jesus. Amen.